Love is patient. Love is kind. Yet we have a story here in which Jesus is going to be thrown off a cliff. Where's the love? Where's the patient and kind love that wants to throw Jesus off a cliff today? I actually think the story in the gospel has a lot of love, but at least part of the love is misguided and blinding. And I want to unpack that with you. Now, many of us know that love can kind of be blinding in a good way, and that it can help us to overlook the obvious faults of another person whom we care about. But love can also be misguided and blinding in that it blocks us from seeing that others are beloved. It can block us from seeing a broader picture of love and relationships. I want to offer two kind of examples from my family that may kind of help flesh this out. My one grandmother fiercely loved her children, and my grandfather on that side of the family actually had a lot of illnesses over the years, and so my grandmother almost was a single parent in a time in a generation where that was pretty rare. And so she, again, was really fiercely kind of protective and cared for and pushed her kids. And when my uncle then grew up, as young men are wont to do, he fell in love with a woman. But what happened is that my grandmother's love was so intense for her one son that she couldn't really ever accept that anyone was going to be good enough for her son. Some of you are nodding like you know this can happen in families. And really, to her dying breath, she refused to love my aunt. It was just always a broken relationship. And again, for her, it grew out of her love for her son, but it was blinding and misguided and didn't allow her to see the love my aunt and uncle had for each other, or the worth and goodness of my aunt. Another example. My grandfather on the other side of my family was kind of like a 50s dad and really protective of my grandmother, kind of like a grizzly bear kind of guy in that way. But he was a great grandfather, and we'd always, as cousins, go up and we'd spend time with my grandparents every year, and we loved it. But one year something happened, kind of an incident that is shrouded in myth and legend in my family. But my two cousins and my brother, for whatever reason, my grandmother called them to come home, and they didn't come right away. Again, I don't really know exactly how this all played itself out, but the end result was that my two cousins and my brother were locked in the basement in chairs facing away from one another, and they had to be silent for over an hour. And what this did was it severed the magic of my grandparents as grandparents for my cousins and my brother. And from that point on, there really wasn't as much of a relationship between my two cousins and my grandfather, and certainly not between their mother and my grandfather. My grandfather did it out of love for my grandmother, but it blinded him to the way in which he had so then severed his relationship with these other family members. And maybe this has happened in your family, where people's love of another person, or love of their job, or love of something that they do, where it's not that it's bad in itself, but it just becomes blinding, and they can't see how there's a whole other world of love going on, and they just miss out on it. In today's gospel from Luke, there's a misguided love. Jesus preaches his first sermon, and the hometown people, at first they're kind of excited, like they love Joseph and Mary, and they're proud that kind of the child from their town seems to maybe be doing good things. And they love their own religion, their traditions of their faith, their Judaism, and they love their own tribe and the way in which they have been an oppressed people that have held it together for centuries over and against foreign occupying powers. Again, they have some really beautiful loves of family, of their town, of their religion, of their tribe. But Jesus knows that this love is misguided, and it's leading them not to really see who he is. And who he is the Messiah. And his job as the Messiah isn't to restore Israel to some level of previous greatness. His job as the Messiah is to be light to all the world. And that's a far bigger job. And Jesus knows their love is misguided, and so he begins to kind of really push them. He wants to show them right off the bat that they're not on the right path. And so he brings up two stories from the Old Testament. And he brings up Elisha and Elijah. And you can't get more Jewish than Elisha and Elijah. These are these ancient prophets that stood up against the foreign gods, that kept the people pure and holy. Yet Jesus brings them up to point out that in both of their ministries, they lived far afield from Israel. They lived on the other side of tracks. And whom did they help? But they helped the one outside of the tribe. In Elijah's case, a widow. In Elisha's case, he not only helped an outsider, but an outsider who was the commander in the opposing army. You can see why the people get so agitated and riled up. Jesus is showing them, he's putting a harsh mirror in front of them that their love is misguided, that they've fallen into that oh-so-human trap of loving one person at the expense of others, of loving one group at the expense of others, of getting into that us versus them tribalism. And on one hand, it might be easy for us as 21st century Americans to say, wow, they really missed the boat with their thinking that God only loves people in their tribe. But actually, these words are really, I think, very hard for us to hear. I think we're at a time as a people when we're so aware of how tribal we've become. And we live in a world that has so many us versus them thinking, where our love of one group, our group, so often blinds us to the goodness and love of others. Urban, rural, black, white, Republican, Democrat, citizen, immigrant. The list goes on, and we feel them and we sense them. And again, we're so kind of caught up recognizing that we're all bound by this tribalism. This last week, my brother, he's a teacher in both an elementary and high school, and he got a memo. And the memo he got was from the superintendent about what they should do if customs and immigration come to the schools to arrest children. That's a chilling email for any teacher to read. As a society, again, we're so struggling with the boundaries of our tribe, and years of broken immigration policy and things that weren't followed through on, and rules that were looked aside. Suddenly we have this political crisis. But it's actually a crisis of love. What do we do with all the children whose no fault of their own find themselves here? Again, we struggle with the same tribalism, with the same us versus the them, with the same kind of love that blinds us to the love of others. So here we've got this gospel. And in many ways, this gospel is almost disappointing. It's deflating. We look at it, and there is no obvious solution for us as a country of how to move forward politically at this point. There's no easy guide here what to do in the case of a failed 20th century immigration policy, or any other of a host of issues that we struggle with. And in fact, it almost serves as a warning against preachers to even touch such topics of us versus them, lest, like Jesus, you want to throw me off a cliff afterward. So where is the love in this passage? I want to offer that actually this passage is all about a love that's patient and kind. Again, this passage is all about a love that is patient and kind. I think Luke includes this story not simply to humble us or to remind us that again and again in society after society we break down into us versus them thinking, that this is just kind of the human condition. But I think Luke wants to set sort of like a benchmarker to show just how far the early church is going to go. Because within just 1 to 2 generations, the church is going to go from a handful of Jewish believers in Jesus who are incredibly concerned that this is really just about us as Jews. Within just 2 generations, it's going to be a transnational, cross-language, cross-cultural, the most diverse organization in the world. So how did they get there? Jesus today offers some suggestions. He offers some foreshadowing of how this is going to play itself out. Because what he does is he says there's these 2 great ancestor prophets, Elisha and Elijah. And what did they both do? They both went to Samaria. So disciples, where do you think we're going to go next? Samaria. And Jesus is going to take his disciples to the other side of the tracks. Jesus is going to take them where the them live. And Jesus is going to love them. And what's so fascinating is Jesus isn't going to give an inch morally on what he thinks is right and wrong, but he's going to give them a mile of his love. He's going to heal them. He's going to feed them. He's going to teach them. And slowly but surely, the disciples are going to have their misguided love reformed and healed. But you see, it's going to take time. In fact, for almost all the disciples, it's at least a 5-year journey for them to move from kind of this us versus them, God loves my tribe more than others, to a sense that God actually loves those who aren't Jewish. This is going to take at least 5 years for most of the disciples, if not longer. Again, God is patient and kind and works on our hearts. And so I'm curious, when in life did God take you to Samaria? When in life did God challenge you, call you, put you in a situation where you were on the other side of the tracks, where you were with the people that were somehow different than yourself? And in the process, your eyes and your heart were opened to say, wow, God's love is bigger than I thought. Person at Bible study this week shared a story. Last fall, as you may remember, there was an election in this country, and everybody's kind of very divided. And it so happened that this one woman in our church sent a text message to a friend, and it was meant to be a picture of her and her grandchild, but there was a big political sign in the back of it. And this was that moment then when the 2 people realized that they were on different sides of this election. They were on different tribes. And communication broke down between the 2 of them. Well, this year, the woman in our church was asked to help on a project that involved knitting. She can knit, but she realized that this project was above her pay grade. It was harder than she had realized. And she realized she needed help. And there really was only one friend who was a good enough knitter to lead her through this. And that was the very friend she hadn't talked to since October. So she kind of said, okay, God, you've got a sense of humor. Let's see what happens here. So she goes back to this kind of friend in hiatus and asks for help. And the other friend is cheerful, glad to help. And in the process of knitting this project, they end up knitting back their friendship together. We live in a world in which there's all sorts of pressure to be flashy, or even on churches to kind of take stands on this and that. But I'm more interested in the love is patient and love is kind. I'm more interested in the almost slow, if not even boring work of stitching back together our society. That again and again is always going to be torn apart by misguided love, whether on family levels or on societal levels. Again, as we have that blinding love and can't see a bigger God, can't see a bigger picture. And so I'm curious in your life, when again did God call you to Samaria, to an experience that challenged you to say, wow, God's love is bigger than I thought. And maybe that was in your family, or maybe that was on a mission trip, or maybe that was on a business venture, could have been all over. But where, again, did God call you to Samaria? There's also, though, another foreshadowing here that's probably even more important. And that's that the people take Jesus up a hill. And they want to kill Jesus. But Jesus isn't quite ready to die yet. But this foreshadows what's ultimately going to happen. Eventually, there's going to be a crowd that does lead Jesus up a hill. And that crowd believes they're motivated by love of God, love of tribe. It's an intense but misguided love. And so they lead Jesus up a hill and they crucify him. But Jesus, with a love that is patient and kind, stretches out his arms and receives it. You see, Jesus recognizes that fundamentally there is a division. There is an us versus them. And on the one side are all the humans who have misguided love. All of us who are blind and get so focused on this or that we miss what God is doing. All of us who succumb again and again to us versus them thinking. And all of us in our misguided love, we're on one side of this divide. We're the them, and then there's Jesus. And Jesus' love is not misguided. Jesus' love is the love that is patient and kind, endures and never fails. His is the love that is divine, that has been there since the foundation of the world and will exist for all time. And Jesus will finally heal this division, and so he lays down his cross. He lays down his cross across that chasm formed by our hatred, formed by our divisions, formed by our sin. And he lays down his cross over that chasm that we might finally be one. For you see, Jesus Christ has died for you. He's died for you and your misguided and blinded love. And he's died for the neighbor that looks like you, and he's died for the neighbor that doesn't look like you. Finally, he's died for all people. Because Jesus intends that one day there would be only one tribe, a tribe that has many languages, that has many skin hues. But it's one tribe that finally sees face to face our God. One tribe that has that love of God so reflected in us that all we can do is be lost in wonder and praise of the living Lord. Amen.